Hello. This video is going to be based on a lecture that I did yesterday. I'm recording it the day after because unfortunately we couldn't get any video or audio recording done during the lecture itself. So I'm going to talk to you for about an hour about masculinities, and feel free to, when I post this video online, to comment on the video if you want to discuss any of the themes further. The slides are fully available on Moodle, and hopefully we can intercut them during the editing process. So this is my lecture on masculinities. For those of you who don't know me already, my name's Sam. I'm a PhD researcher in bisexual and bisexual men and their partners, relationships, identities, and prejudice. So what I want to start off this lecture with is looking at this portrait that you should be able to see here in the slides. This is a portrait of the artist Lucian Freud, who was an artist working in London during the 20th century and in the late 21st century when he died. Freud was actually Sigmund Freud's grandson, that Sigmund Freud, psychiatrist, psychologist. Like his grandfather, he had lots of children, and was, unlike his grandfather, was pretty awful to all of their mothers. He had lots of children by various women, and as a result, pretty bad to the children as well. There's actually a novel and a film based on that novel called Hideous Kinky that you can go away and read about, which details one of his children getting abandoned with their mother in the Middle East by Lucian Freud, essentially, and being cut off from, like, financially and from him as a father. So Freud, as I said, was this very influential 20th century, early 21st century artist. And he was friends with lots of other artists, performance artists, artists like Francis Bacon, who also did fine art painting. And yeah, he was friends with Francis Bacon. You can see in the slide there, he's flanked by two portraits of the performance artist Lee Bowery, who was a consistent subject. Both of those men, so Lee Bowery and Francis Bacon, friends and a model of Francis Bacon, were gay men. They were openly gay. Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud were friends for a period of time. They fell out, but not because of the latter's sexuality. So Francis Bacon was this man who kind of embodied many aspects of traditional masculinity, or had a particular kind of complex masculinity where he's exhibiting misogynist behavior, but is also pretty unbothered by homosexuality, having homosexual friends, painting homosexual men. So he's kind of embodying what we call hegemonic masculinity, which I'll get into in a little bit, and simultaneously kind of, not exemplifying it at the same time. So what I want to use the example of Lucian Freud to do is ask how we can understand men like Lucian Freud's masculinity. How can we understand these kind of complex forms of masculinity? So it's my intention to give you a comprehensive overview of contemporary sociological theory and research on masculinities. Obviously, I'm going to focus more on the theoretical side because it's easier to explain rather than the countless studies that there are on masculinities in the 21st century. We're going to critique some of those sociological understandings of masculinities, and introduce both sociological, queer, and trans-feminist theories of masculinities. So a bit about me, who I am. I use he or they pronouns, or just call me by my name. I don't really mind. My name's Sam. I have an honours degree in psychology from Bar University, and a master's degree in equality and human rights from the University of Glasgow. I've done 2 dissertation projects, undergrad and postgraduate dissertations on asexuality. The first was a systematic literature review, and the second was an oral histories project, which was an empirical project where I interviewed asexual people, some of whom were studying in the University of Glasgow, taking a kind of life histories approach, similar to the kind of research we'll be looking at that Raewyn Connell did as well. So, I did my PhD recently, over 5 years in sociology, focusing on the sociology of bisexuality. I passed my viva in July 2022. My thesis was on British bisexual men, pansexual men and queer men's intimate relationships with their partners. I also interviewed their partners, and I looked at people's relationships with their families. I looked at people's relationships with other people in terms of their sexual identity, and looked at sexual prejudice as well. My broader research interests are in the sociology of sexuality and gender, masculinities, postmodernism, queer theory, and stigma. So what I really want to encourage you as a way of looking at gender is to look at it as this interactive social relationship. So going back to the kind of painting metaphor with Lucy and Freud, think about gender like we would think about the relationship between an artist and their model. So there is kind of a power in those relationships that men have with other men, for example, that other women have with men, and also people who are genderqueer, the kind of relationships that they have with men. I'm using men as the exemplar here because we're talking about masculinities, but it's not just men who can be masculine. So we kind of can't escape these power relations in gender studies. But when we think about power, we shouldn't think about it in a simplistic kind of way. There's also some gendered interactions which are indeed gendered but are more shaped by power relations than others. So this is why intimate relationships are interesting and worth studying. So we as human beings also psychologically and reflexively construct our gender throughout our lives, perhaps as a result of the imagined or real social relationships that we have with people. So you might have, when you're thinking about what to wear today, so how to present your gender, is often we do that through our clothing or through our gestures. You might think in your head, what would my mother think about the clothes that I'm wearing? What would she say about my haircut? What might my dad say, or what might my father say about me posting, pictures of myself wearing certain things, expressing my gender in a certain way on Instagram, for example. So gender is a social construct that is both personal and relational. So we make our own genders. We kind of constantly make and remake our own gender, but we also, we're interactive people. We interact with people through our gender as well. And so we interact with people as men, women, trans, cis, non-binary. All of these things are interactive relationships as well as personal relationships. So this lecture is divided into 3 parts. The first part is going to be focusing on gender order theory and hegemonic masculinity. The key theorist there is Raewyn Connell, who's a sociologist working in Australia. They're a trans feminist, and they're also a Marxist. So that's really important to bear in mind when we're looking at her theories in particular. So the second part is on queer theories of masculinity. So we're going to look at Judith Butler and Jack/Judith Halberstam's work as well. So we're going to be kind of queering both gender and masculinities. In that section, we're going to be looking at queer theory, performativity, and also some transgender politics that comes out of that. The third section is going to be looking at Eric Anderson's inclusive masculinity theory, which is a kind of controversial theory for me because I think it has some limited explanatory power in comparison, particularly to Connell's work. And just a quick note, some of the dates you're going to see, Connell's work began in the 1980s, but I'll sometimes cite them as 2020, which is just the third edition of their book. They've revised their work quite a lot, and it's important to bear in mind the historicity of some of these accounts. So, as I said, Connell's work began in the 1980s, and she's still working on gender today, nearly 40 years later, and has made an enormous contribution, as has Judith Butler and Jack Halberstam, who kind of began writing about these and getting attention for their theories about gender in the 1990s. Eric Anderson's work comes a bit later in the 21st century, early part of the 21st century. So, I'm going to quote from the reading for this lecture. Gender is revealed not merely as an individual attribute or style, but as collective agency, which is both constrained and enabled by social structures, say Messerschmitt and Messner. All societies have cultural accounts of gender, but not all have the concept of masculinity. In its modern usage, the term assumes that one's behavior results from the type of person one is. That is to say, an unmasculine person would behave differently. I'm quoting here, remember. Being peaceable rather than violent, conciliatory rather than dominating, hardly able to kick a football, uninterested in sexual conquest, and so forth. That is a quote from Connell, 2020, which is the second edition of her Masculinities book. So in this quote, Connell is describing masculinity in essentialist terms, what we call essentialist terms. Essentialist terms means that we view gender as there are some kind of essential characteristics about it. And Connell's doing this in order to critique that view. So in sociology, we don't take essentialist terms, we take constructionist terms, which view gender in a very different way, as gender is constructed through social practices rather than being this innate thing that we have and that we express. So she's critiquing that idea of an essential masculinity that is intrinsic to men. That is to say, one that naturalizes toxic, problematic masculine behaviors as being the result of just being a man, for example. And those expressions of gender, if we view those as natural, we see them as being unable to be changed, as fixed traits. So, Connell argues that masculinity, the way that we view masculinity, but masculinity itself, functions as a way to maintain the gender order. So this is where we get the term gender order theory. So what is the gender order? The gender order, we could say it's patriarchy. The hierarchical status quo between men and women. Women and men are ordered in a certain way within societies. Within our society, men have patriarchal power over women, both culturally and economically. Still. So if we're thinking about this in Marxist terms, which Connell is influenced by Marx, Marx would say that there's an economic base. So there's an economic base which is taking wealth that is created by the labor of the proletariat and giving it to the bourgeoisie who own the means of production. But also, society isn't just economics and where the money flows. It is also cultural. So Marx calls this the superstructure. So, because it's built on top of this economic base of exploitation and it structures social relationships. So that's why he calls it a superstructure, because it's built on top of this economic base. So men have most of the power in most societies, both whether that's in the global north or in the global south. That's been true for millennia. That probably will be true, rightly or wrongly, for the 21st century as well. It is changing, but that is still more or less the status quo. Our society and state is structured to favour men, according to Connell. So Connell says that the main axis of power in the contemporary European and American gender order is the overall subordination of women and the dominance of men. The structure, women's liberation, named patriarchy. Connell also talks about the state. So when we think about the state, we think about it in, maybe in Weberian terms. So the way that Max Weber thought about the state, which is something that had monopoly on violence. But Connell thinks about the state as a fundamentally masculine institution. This is not to say, and I'm quoting, or to imply that the personalities of top male office holders somehow seep through and stain the institution. It's actually to say something much stronger, that state organizational practices, so the way that governments are structured, for example, are structured in relation to the reproductive arena. So they're structured in a way that both reproduce themselves but also limit certain kinds of hierarchical reproduction. So certain kinds of ways that maintain this gender order. The overwhelming majority of top office holders are still men because there is a gendered configuring of both, when you think about job markets, recruitment and promotion. So who gets promoted? We talk about glass ceiling often. And who actually gets recruited to the organization, not just promoted within it. Do they recruit more men than women? Certain industries do, engineering industries, for example. There's also a gendered configuring of the internal division of labor and systems of control, a gendered configuring of policy making. So that's the laws that get passed, the laws that govern the country that we're a part of. Also, just of everyday practical routines are gendered. Think about who, when you were growing up or in the house that you live in now, who cooks the meals, who does the cleaning. These are everyday practical routines that are structured in sometimes gendered ways. More often than not, they are. And also, there's a gendered configuration in the ways that we mobilize, that is put into practice, pleasure and consent. So the pleasure, we're not just talking about sexual pleasure, they're talking about leisure time as well. So how do you spend your leisure time? Do you spend it in a gendered way? Do more men than women go out for a drink? Do they do it in gendered groups? There are things like stag parties, hen parties. Who are your friends? Are they mostly other people of your gender, or is there a mix? And are those social relationships different depending on gender? They probably are. So, as I said, Connell is a Marxist theorist, first and foremost, kind of, and often describes masculinity in Marxist terms. So they talk about crises of masculinity. So that's multiple crises of masculinity, which kind of echo Marx's ideas about economic crisis. So Marx had these ideas that, there'd be ruptures and contradictions within capitalism, which would cause periods of crisis. The 2008 financial crisis is a good example of that. Marx's theory talks about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and Connell kind of theorizes masculinity in a similar way, as in it has internal contradictions which result in crises because of a changing landscape of social relationships between men. So kind of within men, between men and other men, but also between men and women. So feminism has caused a crisis of masculinity to some men, not to all men, but certainly to men like Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate. So the Marxist theorists that Connell draws on most apparently for their concept of hegemonic masculinity is Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian Marxist theorist in the 1920s and 30s, and they were interested in how the bourgeoisie maintained cultural as well as economic power and superiority over the working class. So Gramsci termed this cultural hegemony. And this is important because it's the way that cultural institutions and social practices maintain this power and control over the working class. So Connell does exactly the same thing, but she doesn't think about it in terms of bourgeoisie and proletariat so much, although they don't ignore class in their analysis, but they prioritize gendered power relations. So how do men maintain their social dominance in society over other men and women? So primarily women, but also certain types of men. So Connell says that this is done through hegemonic masculinity. So what is hegemonic masculinity? So Connell argues that masculinity is inherently relational. So it's about relationships with other people and how we display ourselves through those relationships. So she breaks down masculinity into 4 components. There was originally 3 in her 1987 analysis, but she's added protest masculinities as a 4th, which is really important for explaining people like Andrew Tate. So the first is hegemonic masculinity, where the theory kind of gets its name. So this is the ideal that a certain culture has of a particular masculinity that men can call upon when invoking their hegemonic, so hegemonic just means dominant, position in society. So their hegemonic power is invoked through displays of hegemonic masculinity. This isn't just power over women, this is also power over other men. So some men embody this type of masculinity successfully, usually through performative displays and behavior. So it could be through excessive drinking, fighting, sports culture, football culture, lad culture, rugby culture, sexist behavior, misogyny, hypersexuality, particularly exaggerated heterosexuality, but also on an insistence on the gender binary and strict gender roles. So I haven't named every aspect or every facet of hegemonic masculine behavior because it varies depending on different cultural contexts. This was Connell's kind of refinement of her theory, which he did with Messerschmitt in an article called Hegemonic Masculinity, Rethinking the Concept. But it's important to recognize that there's not just one hegemonic masculinity, but in me identifying some of those behaviors, you probably recognize that there's a pattern there. That's not to say that every person who likes football, every man who likes football, is some kind of, toxic person. It's just that these are the ways through which masculinity becomes this instrument of power over others in society. So, being really loud, being really socially dominant over a situation is kind of an example of hegemonic masculinity. Whether you do that, watching the sport, swearing at the TV, or going out drinking with your mates, you're kind of implicitly kind of rehearsing and performing hegemonic masculine behavior. So, the second type of masculinity is complicit masculinity. So this is the behavior of men who are not attempting to embody the type of masculinity, hegemonic masculinity that I was talking about previously. But what they're doing is, by being silent or encouraging of this kind of behavior, so allowing it to happen in social situations, allowing themselves to kind of implicitly think these things, implicitly think that, they can, that their friends are fine to go out and, drink to excess and maybe forgive certain behavior which could be described as problematic or toxic, even though they wouldn't necessarily participate in that behavior themselves. By being silent or encouraging hegemonic masculinity's performance and evocation, they benefit in some way socially by this gender order being maintained. So by allowing these kind of behaviors, although not necessarily participating in them, they become complicit in the gender order that favors men above other types of men who are subordinate to hegemonic masculinity and over women. So their masculinity is authorized, but it is not hegemonic necessarily. But they certainly benefit from hegemonic masculinity being a thing that exists within society as a call to order, to the gender order itself. So the idea that men are dominant in society and should be and are naturally dominant in society. So there's a third type, which all of these are interrelated with each other. Obviously, it's easy to see how hegemonic and complicit masculinities are interrelated, but it's important to note that it's not just men who benefit, it's also men who suffer under this patriarchal arrangement. So men who cannot invoke hegemonic masculinity and who are subordinated by it are therefore disqualified from accessing that kind of masculinity. So historically, this has been effeminate, gay men, bisexual men in mainstream society. So they've been kind of disqualified from truly enjoying the same social position that complicit and hegemonic men have in society. So they're kind of disqualified from masculinity. This is why often homophobic insults are aimed towards men who are gay or thought to be gay in feminizing terms, right? They often get feminized. They're called like Nancy, for example. So that that being a historic thing that men were called sort of tries to place them in that subordinate social position that women inhabit in this kind of hegemonic masculine idea about the world. So it also includes just any men whose masculinities fall outside of hegemonic masculinity or who are in direct opposition to hegemonic masculinity. It doesn't even necessarily include men. It could include people who, maybe young girls who are tomboys, or who, or like butch lesbians, for example. Those are still examples of masculine people who suffer under and are subordinated by the social relationship of hegemonic masculinity being the kind of masculine ideal within a certain society. Yeah, so therefore, these people who are examples of subordinate masculinity occupy a marginal social position relative to complicit and hegemonic masculine men. So it's these types of relationships, so these kind of binaries, hegemony on the one hand, domination or subordination, and complicity on the other hand, marginalization and authorization on the other hand. So these are kind of binary frameworks. These all provide a framework for which we can analyze specific masculinities according to Connell. That was a quote from Connell. The fourth type is protest masculinity. So if you've heard of incels, if you've heard of men's rights activists, if you've on the internet encountered anybody who is like an anti-SJW, so anti-social justice warrior person, the atheist community had a lot of these kind of people online. Anybody who's kind of anti-feminist and defines their masculinity in opposition to what they see as a threat from feminism and LGBTQ people is exhibiting this kind of protest masculinity. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. So now I'll talk about the revisions that were made later on to the theory by Connell and Messerschmitt. So in Hegemonic Masculinity, Rethinking the Concept, Connell and Messerschmitt expanded on their original formulation. So they argue that there are different varying contexts which produce different forms of hegemonic masculinities. There's greater emphasis on multiplicity and intersectionality in this kind of revision of the theory. And they say, Connell and Messerschmitt, we need to recognize social struggles in which subordinated masculinities, so the ones I've just described, influence dominant forms of masculinity. So, for example, the gay left in Britain, the Gay Liberation Front in the US and the UK, changed the status quo for gay men, and now we have a lot more. Because of those challenges, we have a lot more social acceptance of gay men in society. There's also, crip theorists who used kind of queer theory and built social movements around disability and queerness, and really engaged with those concepts, just challenge the idea of what disabled people whose masculinity is often subordinated, to change the status quo for them as well, and for them to be perceived differently. So if you think about the Paralympics, for example, this is a good example of the ways in which disability, the way that it's presented and challenged, by disabled people, can really change the status quo around ideas about masculinity, particularly because it's connected to sports as well, which is often seen as very masculine. Often women's sports are denigrated in comparison to men's sports. That's something to bear in mind as well. So Connell and Messerschmitt keep what is good about hegemonic masculinity, the idea of multiple masculinities, the concept of hegemony, the emphasis on change, and they discard what isn't so good about it. So the different the various definitions of men and women's gender traits as, kind of naturalizing this and having a simplistic gender hierarchy where it's just men on the top and women on the bottom. They also add a more complex model of gender hierarchy. So, as I said, it's not just about men's power over women, it's more complicated. And there's a greater emphasis on women's agency in the model. And they introduce this kind of geographic view of masculinity. So there's an interplay between local, regional, and global forms of masculinity, which plays out within this rubric of hegemonic masculinity, because it's not one form of hegemonic masculinity may not be hegemonic in another, in another culture. So, for example, in India, it's quite common for two men to hold hands, whereas in the UK, that's often perceived as gay or effeminate if two men are seen holding hands. But it's normal for two friends to hold hands in India, for example. So they also look at the embodiment of privilege and power in those different cultural contexts as well. And they are interested in how certain men embody privilege. So what kinds of men are hegemonic in those societies? How do they embody hegemonic masculinity? How do they embody subordinate masculinity? How do they embody complicit masculinity within those different cultural contexts? There's more of an emphasis on the dynamics of hegemonic masculinity and the internal contradictions and possibilities of gender democracy that they explore in this article. So I want to emphasize that Connell's theory of hegemonic masculinity is a consistent theory, but this version of it emphasizes certain elements like change and multiplicity. And they say, this is Connell, I'm quoting again from 2020, to recognize more than one kind of masculinity is only a first step. We have to examine the relations between them. Further, we have to unpack the milieu, that's the different types of class and race, and scrutinize the gender relations operating within race and class, which is really, really important. So they're bringing in intersectionality there. There are, after all, and I'm quoting them, gay black men and effeminate factory hands. So it is not so that your masculinity is defined by your class as such or your race. That it's kind of suffused within each. Masculinity operates through these things, and sometimes there are kind of internal contradictions between what is a working class man, for example. Okay, so how can we kind of assess a theory like this, which is quite wide-ranging? So there really has been, it's quite a comprehensive theory. If you read Connell's book and just Connell's work in general, particularly with Messerschmitt, it's by far the most influential scholarly account of masculinity. I'm not just talking for myself there. Other scholars have recognized that it's certainly the most influential theory out there about men and masculinities. It's empirical, so it's based on extensive research. I think the original research project was done in schools, so it looked at the way that boys perform these kind of hegemonic masculine roles within schools. And it's inspired much more empirical social research, which uses Connell's theories. Connell often favoured a life history approach in their research, where she just sat down and interviewed men and asked them about their lives, sort of, from the past right up into the present. And from that kind of extrapolated data to build their theory. And revise their theory continuously as well, which I think is another strength in that the theory is quite flexible. So the theory's really influenced applied practice, ranging from education to anti-violence work, from health, sexual health, actual just men's health in general, physical health, and counselling as well. So it's been really, really influential. Lots of people have taken up this theory and used it productively in society, and it's had real impact. So I want to move on to the second part of the lecture now. This part refers to two queer theorists of gender. So the first is Judith Butler, who you've probably heard of, who wrote a couple of books. They wrote more than 2 books on gender, but these are the key texts, I would say. The first is Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. The second is Bodies That Matter, on the Discursive Limits of Sex. That sex as in biological sex, not on sexuality. The other is Jack, or sometimes Judith Halberstam. And they wrote a book and coined a concept called female masculinity. So both theorists argue that gender is not the same as sex, and that sex is not the primary motivating thing that influences gender. And so sex as a biological category is just as culturally constructed as gender, Judith Butler argues, and so does Halberstam. I'm going to quote from a book about transgender, the fight for transgender rights. Today, there are more categories than ever to choose from for sex, gender, and sexual identities, but still relatively little tolerance for those who don't choose one and stick to it. So the strength of queer theories is that they emphasize the fluidity and instability of sex, gender, and sexuality. So Judith Butler this is a sociology of gender course, but Judith Butler is not a sociologist. It's something to bear in mind. They're a feminist theorist and philosopher, so they've had some impact on the field of sociology, but Connell is the real kind of social theorist of masculinity, rather than Judith Butler. Judith Butler's interested in gender broadly. They've been very influential, whether you like their theories or not, essentially. They're a bit of a Marmite theorist. They're quite difficult to read, so I'm going to do my best to summarize some of their quite complicated ideas, which are often put across in their books in quite complex ways. So I'm just going to quote from Judith Butler from Gender Trouble. Simone de Beauvoir wrote in The Second Sex that one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one. The phrase is odd, even nonsensical, for how can one become a woman if one wasn't a woman all along? And who is this one, who is this self, who does the becoming? Is there some human that becomes its gender at some point in time? How does one become a gender? what is the moment or mechanism of gender construction, they ask. And perhaps most pertinently, when does this mechanism arrive on the cultural scene to transform the human into a gendered subject? So as we're moving through a cultural world, a social world, when does gender arrive there? Is it through social interactions? Is it not? Are those foundations already there in discourses about gender? I'll continue with my quote of Judith Butler here. Are there ever humans who are not, as it were, always already gendered? The mark of gender appears to qualify bodies as human bodies. The moment in which an infant becomes humanized is when the question, is it a boy or a girl, is answered. So there's some interesting ideas in there, particularly when we think about gender being assigned at birth. So gender is assigned based on usually doctors interpreting ultrasounds or just looking at the anatomy of an infant and deciding, usually, is it a boy or a girl? The categories of intersex do exist, and there are intersex babies. Often surgery historically has been performed on these people to reassign people to a more binary gender. So that's something to bear in mind as well when we think about how gender is assigned at birth and the ways in which discourses and ideas about gender roles influence the way in which we get branded as male or female and not in between. It's this clear demarcation of boy and girl that Judith Butler is trying to deconstruct and show the contradictions within these kind of strict gender roles and sex roles. So Butler's key ideas in relation to gender and relation to masculinity are performativity. So they argue that gender is not this natural category that exists, but it only seems natural because we repeatedly perform it all the time through everyday practices, so cultural practices. So when we're talking about culture, we're talking about sort of pre-existing things that happen that we only have a very limited control over. Social things we can kind of control and influence around us on a more local scale. But obviously there are large social structures, institutions, health institutions, governmental institutions which shape things like gender. And thus gender becomes naturalized through repeated everyday performances of it by us. So we rehearse and perform gender, our own gender, but we also sort of perform it in front of everybody else. So we do this performance for ourselves to feel masculine, to feel feminine, to feel androgynous, but also we do this in a gendered way as the result of our body, in the way that our bodies are read. So in the way that my body is read as being a man, in the way that maybe other people's bodies are read as being a woman. So how do people understand sex, gender, and sexuality in society? Butler argues that this is done through a rubric. So that's a kind of like a concept called the heterosexual matrix. So this is the ways in which sex, gender, and sexuality are made intelligible. So the way that other people comprehend this, so the way that we kind of culturally, as a society, comprehend and make sense of sex, gender, and sexuality. And Judith Butler says that this is done in binary ways of thinking and interpreting. So when we think about sex, we think about male or female. We don't think about a mix of the two. We think about gender as, man or woman. Those are the two binary categories which are in opposition to each other. When we think about sexuality, we think about straight or queer, or straight or gay. So whether that's a gay woman or a gay man. So in the heterosexual matrix, if you fall outside these kind of categories of sex, gender, and sexuality, these binary fixed categories, you create what Butler calls gender trouble, and your gender is transgressive to the social order, and is unintelligible. It's rendered outside of comprehension. It cannot be comprehended by other people outside of that cultural frame of reference, which is the heterosexual matrix. So along with sexuality goes this idea of domination and submission as well. The idea that men are dominant and women are submissive, both sexually and socially. Okay, so Jack Halberstam wrote an influential book called Female Masculinity, in which they ask the question, if masculinity is not the social and cultural and indeed political expression of maleness, so to do with sex as a category, then what is it? So if masculinity isn't male, then what is it? So it's looking at masculinity without men. And they argue that effeminacy in men has been over-theorized because of a lot of social anxiety, societal anxiety about female, about kind of feminine men, effeminate men. Less so on masculine women. I'm going to quote from Halberstam, I am writing about women who feel themselves to be more masculine than feminine. And I'm trying to explain why, as a culture, we seem to take so little interest in female masculinity and yet pay a considerable amount of attention to male femininity. So there's been a lot more criminalisation in the UK of same-sex relations between men rather than women and women's sexual relations, for example. So they're shifting the focus from masculinity as something that men do, decoupling it from men and maleness and the male body, and arguing that anyone can feel and perform masculinity regardless of their body and their sex assigned at birth. So they are considering lesbian and transgender masculinities here. Then they talk about their own experiences. So I'm going to quote from Halberstam again. I was a masculine girl, and I am a masculine woman. For much of my life, my masculinity has been rendered shameful by public responses to gender ambiguity. However, in the last 10 years, I've been able to turn stigma into strength. This is another intervention of queer theory, is that queer theory emphasizes transgression as a kind of form of activism and as protest against these kind of very strict binary cultural understandings. And that is the way to liberate yourself according to queer theorists, is to transgress these societal norms. And that can, by causing this gender trouble, you actually liberate yourself from concepts like gender and all the constraints that go with it, and all the baggage of identity. Masculinity must not and cannot and should not reduce down to the male body and its effects, according to Halberstam. I was quoting then. Far from being an imitation of maleness, female masculinity actually affords us a glimpse of how masculinity is constructed as masculinity. In other words, female masculinities are framed as the rejected scraps of dominant masculinity in order that male masculinity may appear to be the real thing. So in framing other forms of masculinity as lesser, as subordinate, as disgusting, as wrong, as aberrant, as transgressive, it reifies the original concept of masculinity, of male masculinity. So female masculinity is there in order to construct men as being the sole possessors of this good form of masculinity. So in their research, they look at the kind of butch-femme dichotomy that is, exhibited in some lesbian relationships, and they think about how this is troubled or played with, this particular binary. And they consider how sexuality, like lesbian sexuality, engenders gendered performances of butch and femme, maybe as a way to make oneself intelligible, but also to kind of play and transgress with these gender roles, because it's two women putting on this performance, usually. So they write that female masculinity is constructed as a failed version of heroic male masculinity, which subordinates alternative forms of masculinity, both male and female, in order to define itself. They consider fiction, where these forms of female masculinity are in play. A good example of this is recently a TV show called Gentleman Jack, which I think was on the BBC or Channel 4, I can't remember. A TV show about a Victorian woman who lives in that particular Victorian society as a man, dresses as a man and interacts with other men as a man, which is a really good example of the kind of female masculinity that Halberstam is describing here. So, Halberstam wrote an article in 2012 called Global Female Masculinity, and they describe the way that gender variance and theories about transgender identification, particularly queer theories of trans identification, like the work of Judith Butler, is theorized in this quite specific local context of the USA. So it's kind of doing a similar thing that the Connell and Messerschmitt argument did to Connell's original theories. And they say that this has broad implications when it gets universalized. So they're not necessarily saying that Judith Butler has kind of universalized their own work, but when it's taken up, when these kind of queer theories are taken up and universalized and assumed to not be kind of describing quite local phenomenon in the United States, for example, when it's universalized to the whole world, it creates some issues, essentially, with the theory. So Butler theorizes transgender issues in a certain way that is both academic and North American, but there are also tensions about Butler's trans theories from some trans people and communities, and some tensions between queer theory and certain forms of trans politics. Halberstam, I'm quoting here again, at their best, transgender politics are part of a larger form of queer critique that destabilizes the foundations of heteronormativity, so the idea that heterosexuality is normal and natural in society, and questions the stability of gender, family, and nation. So they're saying trans politics should be aligned with that. But they say they're kind of like critiquing some forms of trans politics which are very, what we call identitarian. So they're focused on this like fixed notion of gender identity, of one's gender identity being, you know, the opposite of what they were assigned at birth, which they say is not very queer. So this is their own argument. I don't necessarily agree with this. How do we understand then and explain the impact of transness upon not only traditional gendering, but upon queer communities, and even on the ebb and flow of sexual and gender definition globally? So that is what they're kind of exploring in that article. I would encourage you to read the article. It's interesting. It raises some interesting questions. Moving on to some critiques of Butler and Halberstam's queer theories of masculinities and of gender in general. So a sociologist might look at Judith Butler's work and look at their work on performativity and say that, hey, they're just copying Erving Goffman. So Erving Goffman argued that the gendered self, or just the self in general, as a performative interaction with other people is you know, that's his work. And certainly Stevie Jackson and Sue Scott, who are both sociologists, have argued this in their book Theorizing Sexuality. To this, I would say this is kind of true, but not exactly. I don't think it's plagiarism or anything like that. I think Butler's interested in more how cultural practices and discourses shape ideas about sex, gender, and sexuality, whereas Goffman's more interested in the interaction itself, so more into the idea that the self is a kind of social construct that gets performed and not performed in certain cultural and social contexts. So he talks about the idea of front stage and backstage. This is more dramaturgical than it is kind of everyday performances. Both are sort of sociological theories of everyday life, but one emphasizes cultural discourses more than the other, and these kind of roles in society that can be accessed more readily. So they're quite similar, but they're not exactly the same, I would argue. Some second wave feminists have argued that womanhood is an essentially feminine experience. It has this experiential, this phenomenological quality, which is essentially feminine. Women's bodies, they argue, are biologically and essentially female, and their experiences are therefore feminine. So their bodies are female, they experience those bodies in a feminine way. Halberstam obviously doesn't agree with this. They challenge the idea that women experience their gender as feminine. They say that this is simply not how, they experience their own gender or other women experience themselves, nor their identities as women. And there's no unified experience of being a woman, according to both Halberstam, Butler, but also black feminist theorists like bell hooks as well, whose work is excellent. And I would encourage you to go away and read their book, particularly Ain't I a Woman, is pretty essential reading for black feminist thought. So, third wave feminists like Nancy Fraser disagree that sex is this cultural construct. So Butler's trying to say that it's not just gender that's this cultural construct. Sex isn't this biological reality or imperative, it's this cultural construct as well. Nancy Fraser kind of disagrees with this and says that gender is definitely socially and culturally constructed, but sex isn't. And often this is a sticking point for debates within feminist circles about sex and gender. And they say that actually Butler's work focuses on identity and performativity, and that this has been bad for the feminist movement because it's taken us away from the realities of what can actually liberate feminists. So Nancy Fraser has a book called Fortunes of Feminism, which is an edited collection of her essays, which is very good and contains some critiques of Judith Butler. Halberstam argues that the very insights, and I'm quoting, that Butler works from in their own work, insights about the trouble of being, so they're talking about gender trouble, about the fragmentation of the self, the refusals of unified identities and categories are often discarded when it comes to the characterization of their work as a whole. So they're saying that people treat Judith Butler unfairly, really, and they don't look at their work holistically. So, up until now, I've presented you with theories of masculinities that I think are good theories. Only one of those theories has actually been a sociological theory of masculinity, though. The others have been queer theories, which are not exactly sociological. I want to show you another data-driven, so empirical sociological theory of masculinity and describe it to you because it's really the only other theory of masculinity within sociology. There's a problem, though. I don't really like it. I think it's a bad theory, and I don't think it works. I think it has very little explanatory power, which means that I don't think it really explains much about masculinities in our society. But I will describe it to you because it's increasingly influential. So, the basis of Eric Anderson's inclusive masculinity theory is that society has fundamentally changed so much for men that the AIDS crisis and all the homophobia that went with that may as well not have existed, in the way that men experience masculinity now. And that all of that, all of the AIDS crisis and the panic about homosexuality, it may as well have not existed. Homophobia is no longer the shadow under which gay and bisexual men have to live their lives, according to Anderson and their co-authors. Which, to a certain extent, is true. More or less, full sexual citizenship has been afforded to certain cisgender, white, gay, middle-class men, like Anderson. Class is also important when thinking about who has benefited from this sexual citizenship, as moral panics around working-class sexuality have always been a point of anxiety for politicians. Hugh Lemmy and Ben Miller, in their book Bad Gays, consistently argue this. The historian of sexuality, Jeffrey Weeks, argues this as well. And that's fairly plain. Diane Richardson notes that a different kind of questioning of the significance of sexuality to citizenship is associated with the moves towards cultural normalization and social inclusion of lesbians and gay men in the UK and in many European countries, as well as elsewhere in the world, including Canada, Australia, and parts of the USA. So Anderson and his co-author Mark McCormack describe this normalization of LGBT rights and discourse as evidence of a decline in what they call homohysteria, which is a conceptual view of history that claims that there were times of heightened anxiety about appearing to be queer as a man or living as a gay man, expressing any kind of homosexual desire or the suspicion of homosexuality in homosocial environments, so environments which are dominated by men. And in the past, this would have led to victimization. So in the 1950s, this would have led to victimization. In the 1980s, this would have led to kind of victimization and bullying and so forth and violence. In short, times of heightened homohysteria are times when to be gay is to live in fear. Anderson claims that the time period we are now in is no longer one of heightened homohysteria. I would argue that this dislocates the experience of anxiety about being a gay man from the rest of the LGBT community, especially when lesbians are still subject to invisibility, so are bi people. Trans people are often under attack in the UK and US press, media, and there's just a lot of vitriol targeted at the LGBT community in the 21st century, in the time that we live. And yeah, we can see that there's constant negative press attention about trans people in general, but also about trans athletes in the specific. There have been, mass shootings in LGBT spaces and places in the US. A trans teenager was recently murdered in the UK. I don't know how this isn't a time of increased homohysteria. Really, it seems that we need to take all of the LGBT issues into account when we're thinking about the way that men experience masculinity, particularly gay men, and not just a certain subsection of gay men. Particularly when you think about, drag queen story time, which is, an example of kind of gender transgression being attacked in the UK and US media. People like Ada HD coming under scrutiny for no reason than just reading stories to kids. Pantomimes have existed in the UK for like 200 years. It's bizarre to me that there's such this moral panic over drag queen story time when pantomimes are literally exactly the same thing. And most people go to a pantomime, take their kids, and have no issues with it. So it seems strange to pick up on drag queen story time as a particularly transgressive thing when it's really not. We've recently had some moral panics about monkeypox as well, that have kind of brought back up some of the anxieties that the media showed around bisexual men. And there's parallels there to the 1980s coverage of the AIDS crisis in the way that particularly Verity Ritchie has shown that framing has lingered around the idea that bisexual men were a kind of conduit of AIDS and HIV from the kind of straight world to the gay world and vice versa, particularly vice versa, from the gay world to the straight world. They were seen as this kind of bridge between the two communities, which were largely separate in many of the minds of people. And that stigma has stuck with bisexual men, as I said. The problem, in my view, with inclusive masculinity is that it's fundamentally disconnected from the social reality of women and LGBTQ lives, despite being empirical and despite being a well-constructed theory of masculinity. It's true that men's relationship with other men is changing. So Eric Anderson is very interested in things like bromances, male friends, otherwise exhibiting some characteristics of hegemonic masculinity, now may be seen doing the kind of things that are shown on the front cover of Inclusive Masculinity, which, is worth noting. But as Connell points out, that's never really been what masculinity has been about at its core. Masculinity at its core is relational. It's about men's relationship with women because it's defined in opposition to women. What masculinity is, it's like not femininity. And it's often, while it may be true that two men kissing is no longer always considered feminine and therefore shows some kind of shift in attitudes about the ways that we permit men's social and sexual scripts to be more flexible than in the 1950s or the 1980s, for example. But this is not evidence of a decline in homophobia, I argue, nor is it evidence that women are liberated from the consequences of masculinity. If masculinity was inclusive, then why is there still so much misogyny and homophobia in our society? Why are there still hate crimes against LGBT people? Why is there still misogynistic hate crime against women? And, you know, trans women in particular, but also when we think about the Metropolitan Police, you know, the recent murder of Sarah Everard, the kinds of people that are allowed still within the Metropolitan Police. These are things that are worth examining and things that inclusive masculinity doesn't really account for, in my opinion. So Eric Anderson is interested in, as I said, things like bromances, but also how men are more unafraid of doing things, performing behaviors that other people in the 1980s, for example, might have thought was gay. So kissing each other on the mouth, hugging, cuddling with each other, even having sex with other men, heteroflexibility without it being defined by identity necessarily. Which is interesting and should be theorized, in my opinion. But again, it relies on how can we think about masculinity now that homophobia isn't a big deal. And like, you can't really, unless you argue that homophobia is declining, but I've showed, I think, all the ways in which homophobia culturally in the UK, acceptance of LGBT people is not at an all-time high. It's actually fallen based on social attitudes. So it's actually fallen. There's a recent British social attitude survey which showed that it's fallen for the first time, you know, in about 10 years, acceptance of LGBT people. So the argument that masculinity is changing for the better and that it's loosening up a bit, becoming more flexible, and that men are less bothered about seeming masculine and about, you know, seeming less traditionally masculine is complex. So let's look at some of the research now. So Anderson and his co-authors Chvatik and Hardwick interviewed young Czech men in their rural village and revealed surprisingly relaxed attitudes about gay men when they were interviewing these young men in this rural Czech village. And they argued that they showed examples of inclusive masculinity rather than of hegemonic masculinity. However, Shimkova in 2019 argued kind of against this and showed that hegemonic masculinity was actually more apparent in Czech men's vlogs, so that's video blogs, than American blogs. So they were doing a kind of cross-cultural comparison of this kind of organic social media material that was being produced by Czech vloggers, Czech influencers versus American influencers and vloggers. And they showed that American vloggers tended to show more instances of inclusive masculinity. So that kind of complicates the original study by Chvatik and Anderson and Hardwick. So that's something to bear in mind, is that the research on this is kind of contentious. And as I've said, this is a controversial theory for me. I don't think it explains masculinity, the range of masculinities that we're seeing, very well. And I think it's in some ways dangerously presumptive, because it assumes that LGBT rights are cast iron and that societies can change, but that change is permanent, whereas hard-fought things like LGBT rights have to be defended. And I think that undermines the cause of defending these things. So Anderson has a tendency to cite himself and his own work and people that agree with him and his particular theory of inclusive masculinity, which I've argued only really accounts for men's relationships with other men of roughly equal status. And it says very little about how masculinity mediates men's interactions with women. This is something that's argued by Rachel O'Neill in her 2015 article, With a Critical Masculinity Studies. So here is an example of Anderson engaging in self-citational practices. So he cites, and I'm sort of quoting from Rachel O'Neill's article here, he cites another scholar's praise for his work in the introduction to one of their articles into the Czech study that I was describing. So Borkovska, cited in Schwatek, Hardwick, and Anderson, has recently described masculinity studies, and I'm quoting, occurring in 3 theoretical stages, of which the latest she describes as Andersonian. This, she argues, is because recent masculinity research has shown a shift from hyper or orthodox forms of masculinity, so they're kind of implicitly describing hegemonic masculinity here, to those that are softer in their measurable presentations. So Anderson's account, his papers tend to, self-cite these kind of things of people who agree with the things. And while I'm not saying they don't engage with critical voices about their work, but they have a tendency to favor studies and authors who agree with them. As I've argued, Anderson's account is ahistorical and makes little sense when considering a socio-political context such as post-Brexit Britain, where anti-LGBTQ hate crime is increasingly reported. We've got an increasingly hostile media reception for trans and LGBT people more broadly. It doesn't really account for USA, the challenges that we've had from the Supreme Court in the USA after Trump, which are arguably, in my view, times of increased homohysteria. Anderson can't account for, with inclusive masculinity, the sustained violence against women, structural misogyny, for example, the Met Police in the UK, and LGBTQ people. So it doesn't really account for gay bashing or anything like that, or hate crimes against LGBT people perpetrated by men in a variety of cultural contexts, at the heart of which I think is the issue of masculinity, which it fails to explain. Connell describes new forms of protest masculinity. So this has come into sharp focus with the increased media attention on Andrew Tate, which came from his arrest after tweeting to Greta Thunberg. So Connell's study of protest masculinity is important for describing these kind of figures, from the manosphere, these internet influences about masculinity. So people like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson. And they quote, I quote them here, adult masculinity is built on overreactions to femininity and the connection of making masculinity, so that is constructing one's masculinity with the subordination of women. So that's building it in opposition to feminism and to, femininity in general. I don't think Anderson can account for these kind of developments that we're seeing now with Andrew Tate and other figures who are similar to him that we've been seeing for the past 20 years, really, on social media. So Connell writes, the achievement of manhood is a project defined within the collectivity of young men via protest and violence, and defined by a pattern of motives arising from the childhood experience of powerlessness and resulting in an exaggerated claim to the potency that European culture attaches to masculinity. Among these young men, too, there is a response to powerlessness, a claim to the gendered position of power, a pressured exaggeration. So, for example, bashing gays, LGBT hate crime, or hate crime against LGBT people, wild riding. So, a pressured exaggeration of masculine conventions. This is what Connell describes as protest masculinity, and I don't think Anderson's theory can really account for this. And I would challenge them to expand their theory to include these kind of resistances to feminism and femininity in their account of inclusive masculinity. So, like it or not, I don't really like the theory personally, but I think I have made that clear, and I think I've made that clear why. And it's not an attack on Eric Anderson personally or any of his co-authors. I think the theory is increasingly influential because we're seeing this more flexible masculinity now, and seeing some men move away from hegemonic masculinity, but also we're seeing some men move towards it as well, which I think is the more concerning development and that needs some sort of theoretical accountability. I think Connell's theory still rings true, and I still think their revised new edition of the Masculinities book in 2020 does an excellent job of explaining these kind of masculinities. And I commend both theorists for engaging with critics of their theories. That's really important for us to do as social scientists. So the last thing I'd like you to do is to invite you to think about, I talked a little bit about black feminism, but really all of these theorists have in common something which limits their analysis, which is that they write from the perspective of white academics in the global north. So if we're going to approach masculinities, we should always do so from a perspective that looks at them intersectionally. That is, it looks at race, at class, etc., ability, disability, from a perspective that emphasizes, these are social constructs, and that as intersecting and as unique identity categories. I think it's telling that all these theorists move through the world as white middle-class people, and I think it has had an impact on the way that they theorize. They are all influenced by black feminist ideas. I don't know how you couldn't be. If you're working in gender studies in the 21st century, it's simply been a massive theoretical development by Kimberly Crenshaw, the Combahee River Collective, Angela Davis. All these people have been influential on gender studies, like without a shadow of a doubt. I'm confident every theorist has read, one or other of these authors, bell hooks, for example. Crucially, though, they don't represent, Judith Butler, Raewyn Connell, Jack Halberstam, Eric Anderson. They don't represent the broad milieu of people that their theories can apply to. And therefore, we should always be critical of what they have to say. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening. And if you've got any questions, please do post them in the comments.